In the spring of 1943, beneath low coastal clouds that hung heavy over the Oregon shoreline, Lillian Carter knelt on the cold pavement of Main Street with a bucket of soapy water and a stiff bristled brush, scrubbing at chalked words that someone had scrawled across the curb outside the shipyard gates, words questioning why defective medical kits were being sent overseas, while townspeople walked past pretending not to notice her, because the local civil defense warden had declared that public doubt in wartime equaled public disloyalty, and he had ordered Lillian to erase the message in silence as an example of what happened to those who spread defeatist talk. The accusation stemmed from a conversation she had shared at the factory 2 days earlier, after receiving a letter about her younger brother Thomas, an infantryman injured in North Africa whose unit reported shortages of sterile bandages and morphine ampules, and when she voiced fear that rushed supply quotas might be responsible, someone carried her concern to the warden as rumor of sabotage sympathy, turning private worry into civic punishment, under the pretense of protecting morale. The bristles tore against her palms as she scrubbed harder, aware that refusing the order could cost her job at the shipyard's medical supply warehouse, a position that kept her mother housed and ration coupons steady. Yet, accepting humiliation in silence felt like surrendering the truth she had glimpsed in packing crates marked inspection approved. Despite visible shortages, a small crowd gathered at a distance, not hostile but cautious, because wartime towns feared appearing soft on dissent, and the warden stood nearby with arms folded, reminding anyone who met his eye that unity demanded discipline, until the steady hum of an approaching Army ambulance drew attention. Down the block, and a U.S. Army medic stepped out, his uniform marked with dust from convoy duty along the Pacific coast, pausing when he noticed a civilian woman ordered to scrub pavement under watchful supervision. He approached without raising his voice, asking the warden under what regulation a civilian warehouse clerk was being disciplined publicly for expressing concern about medical supply shipments, and when the warden dismissed it as internal morale enforcement, the medic crouched beside Lillian, read the faint remnants of chalk beneath her brush, and recognized the specific kit designation referenced in the erased words, a designation he had seen flagged in field reports only weeks earlier. Without dramatic flourish, he took the brush gently from her hand, set it aside, and helped her stand, stating calmly that if concerns involved medical readiness for American soldiers, they warranted review rather than punishment, and in that quiet gesture pulling her away from the pavement instead of allowing silence to swallow her. The spectacle of enforced obedience fractured beneath the weight of informed resistance. The warden's expression hardened as the medic helped Lillian to her feet, but he hesitated to escalate the confrontation in front of a uniformed serviceman whose insignia marked him as attached to an active Army medical convoy. And as the small crowd lingered uncertainly along the boardwalk, the medic introduced himself as Corporal James Halpern, explaining that he was temporarily stationed along the Pacific Supply Route overseeing incoming medical shipments bound for training units and coastal defense posts. Once they had stepped a short distance from the curb, Lillian revealed that her so-called defeatist remark had come from a letter she received the previous week, stating that her brother Thomas's field hospital had run short of sterile dressings during a mortar barrage, forcing medics to improvise with limited supplies, and she admitted that she had noticed discrepancies in the packing lists at the shipyard warehouse where she worked, including missing morphine vials and reduced gauze counts inside crates stamped complete, observations that had unsettled her long before the letter arrived. Halpern listened with focused attention, recognizing the medical kit code she mentioned as one recently flagged in an internal memo referencing inconsistent supply quantities along certain transport lines. And when Lillian described how she had quietly compared warehouse inventory sheets against outgoing manifests only to find unexplained adjustments initialed by supervisors, he realized that her concern was not rumor, but pattern recognition from someone positioned inside the distribution chain. She explained that she had spoken in frustration to a co-worker, saying that if her brother's unit was suffering because someone at home rushed inspections, then silence felt like complicity, and that statement, twisted into alleged defeatism, had been enough for the warden to publicly discipline her in the name of morale. Halpern's jaw tightened at the thought that legitimate supply concerns were being reframed as disloyalty, and he told her that field medics often received crates labeled fully stocked, only to discover shortages that endangered wounded men, shortages attributed vaguely to shipping constraints rather than specific oversight failures. The realization that her private fear aligned with his professional experience shifted their interaction from sympathetic interruption to emerging partnership, because what began as humiliation on a public street now intersected with documented inconsistencies in medical readiness. And as the crowd slowly dispersed under the uneasy awareness that something more serious than chalk words had been erased, Lillian understood that the medic's intervention had not merely spared her dignity, it had opened the possibility that the truth behind the missing supplies might finally be examined rather than scrubbed away. Lillian could have accepted Corporal Halpern's intervention as enough, returned home quietly, and allowed the incident to dissolve into rumor. But as they walked along the damp edge of the harbor road, she admitted that the public humiliation had stripped away whatever caution once restrained her, because the fear of speaking had already been realized, and there was little left to lose except the truth. She explained that in the warehouse she had noticed subtle alterations in inventory sheets, columns adjusted after inspection stamps were applied, quantities corrected in darker ink, and certain crates resealed with fresh twine despite being logged as untouched, patterns that suggested someone was diverting portions of medical supplies before shipment while preserving the appearance of full compliance. And when Halpern asked whether she had confronted her supervisors directly, she answered that questioning them openly risked immediate dismissal under the same accusation of harming morale, a charge flexible enough to silence anyone who disrupted the narrative of flawless production. Halpern acknowledged that Army medics in forward positions often received incomplete kits that forced dangerous improvisation, and he revealed that a confidential report circulating among convoy personnel had traced repeated shortages to supply points along the Pacific route, without identifying the exact warehouse responsible, meaning the Oregon shipyard could represent one link in a broader chain of mismanagement or black market diversion. Lillian stopped walking and faced him squarely, and stating that if her brother's unit and others like it were suffering because someone at home skimmed supplies or falsified manifests, then silence would make her complicit in every preventable loss, and she proposed gathering concrete documentation, photographing mismatched crate contents, copying altered ledger entries, and tracking shipment codes that aligned with field shortage reports, so that any claim of hysteria or defeatism could be countered with verifiable evidence. Halpern cautioned that confronting warehouse supervisors tied to local defense authority might provoke retaliation stronger than street humiliation, yet he agreed that documented proof carried weight beyond rumor, especially if linked to medical readiness for active units, and his fishing boats rocked quietly in the harbor behind them. They forged an understanding rooted not in romance or impulse, but in shared obligation to the wounded men whose survival depended on unseen details. By the time they parted that evening, Lillian had resolved not merely to defend her reputation, but to trace the missing supplies to their source, transforming the medic's simple act of pulling her away from public shame into the first step of a deliberate campaign to expose what silence had long concealed. The following morning, Lillian reported to the shipyard warehouse as if nothing had shifted, moving through rows of stacked medical crates, under the watchful presence of supervisors who appeared more concerned with maintaining production quotas than examining inventory discrepancies, and she resumed her clerical duties with practiced precision, logging shipment codes and verifying inspection stamps while discreetly noting serial numbers linked to the kit designation mentioned in her brother's letter. The warehouse floor smelled faintly of treated canvas and antiseptic, and from her position near the dispatch desk, she could observe how certain crates marked priority transfer bypassed standard double-check procedures, sealed swiftly and wheeled toward outbound trucks without the routine count verification she had been trained to perform, a pattern that had once unsettled her privately but now stood out with sharper clarity as potential evidence rather than suspicion. Meanwhile, Corporal Halpern positioned himself at the coastal supply checkpoint, under the pretext of reviewing inbound manifests from Oregon facilities, cross-referencing field reports of shortages against shipment codes, and identifying overlaps between the flagged kit numbers and those processed through Lillian's warehouse, and when he relayed to her, through a brief cautious exchange near the dock, that at least 3 field hospitals had reported incomplete morphine allotments tied to identical serial sequences, the coincidence hardened into confirmation. During her midday ledger update, Lillian accessed archived inventory logs stored in a side cabinet reserved for clerical reconciliation, but discovering that quantities of sterile gauze and morphine ampules had been adjusted downward. After inspection stamps were recorded, alterations initialed by a warehouse supervisor, whose signature appeared repeatedly beside the same kit codes flagged in Halpern's convoy notes. Feigning routine bookkeeping, she copied the relevant shipment numbers and compared them to outgoing dispatch records, noting the timing of adjustments and the rapid resealing of crates destined for coastal transport. And when she discreetly lifted the lid of a partially prepared kit under the guise of verifying contents, she confirmed that the physical count of bandages fell short of the documented total, a discrepancy small enough to escape casual review but significant enough to compound across dozens of shipments. By the time her shift ended, Lillian possessed a list of correlated serial numbers linking altered warehouse logs to reported field shortages, and as she met Halpern at the harbor edge once more, they understood that the pattern now extended beyond rumor into documented manipulation, positioning them on the brink of intercepting a live shipment to prove that the missing supplies were not battlefield chaos but homefront mismanagement, concealed beneath stamped approval seals. By late afternoon, a fresh convoy of medical crates marked for transfer to a coastal training hospital rolled onto the loading dock, and Lillian recognized several serial numbers from her copied list stamped boldly along the wooden sides, the ink still dark from recent handling, indicating that the kits had been adjusted and resealed within the last 24 hours. She kept her expression neutral, while supervisors urged speed over scrutiny, reminding clerks that delay equaled inefficiency in wartime. Yet, as dock workers began lifting the crates onto the transport truck, Corporal Halpern arrived under the authority of routine readiness verification, presenting a convoy memorandum citing reported field inconsistencies and requesting immediate spot inspection of priority medical shipments, a move that drew irritation from the warehouse foreman but could not be easily refused without appearing indifferent to frontline medical needs. Under the watchful gaze of workers and the uneasy presence of the local defense warden, who had ordered Lillian to scrub the street days earlier, Halpern selected 3 crates matching the flag serial numbers and pried open their lids, allowing Lillian to step forward as official count witness, and as the contents were laid out on a canvas tarp. The shortage became undeniable. Gauze bundles counted 4 short of the manifest total. Morphine ampules were reduced by nearly a third, and sterile sutures were substituted with lower-grade thread intended for non-critical procedures, a discrepancy small enough to escape casual audit, but dangerous. When multiplied across dozens of wounded soldiers depending on precise dosage and sanitation, murmurs spread among dock workers who had assumed inspection stamps guaranteed accuracy, and when Halpern compared the manifest sheet to the physical inventory in clear view of the crowd, the illusion of flawless supply fractured visibly. The foreman attempted to attribute the shortage to packing error at an earlier facility, yet Lillian calmly produced her copied ledger entries showing quantity reductions, initialed within their own warehouse hours before shipment, aligning the altered log times with the crate resealing marks still visible along the edges, and as tension thickened in the harbor air, Halpern radioed his convoy command requesting temporary hold status on all outgoing medical shipments from the Oregon facility pending further review, an action that effectively froze transport and elevated the matter beyond local management. For Lillian, the moment carried both vindication and risk, because public proof of shortage confirmed her concerns but also ensured confrontation with those who preferred silence, and as the halted truck idled against the gray coastal sky, the town realized that what had begun as chalk words on a curb now threatened to expose a breach in wartime trust far more serious than whispered doubt. The halt order echoed across the harbor faster than the truck's engine noise, and by evening the coastal town buzzed with tension as supervisors convened an emergency meeting inside the municipal hall, framing the shipment freeze not as necessary verification, but as disruptive interference that risked delaying vital medical supplies to American servicemen. The civil defense warden seized the narrative swiftly, declaring that panic had once again been stirred by defeatist insinuations originating from the same warehouse clerk publicly disciplined days earlier, and he accused Lillian of deliberately manufacturing suspicion to undermine morale at a time when unity was essential, a charge designed to redirect public concern away from missing morphine and toward perceived disloyalty. When deputies arrived at her boarding house with a formal summons to appear before a town hearing, the message was unmistakable. Rather than examine internal mismanagement quietly, the leadership intended to scrutinize her motives openly. Inside the hall, beneath framed portraits of local veterans and patriotic posters urging sacrifice, Lillian stood before council members who appeared divided between caution and loyalty to established authority, while Halpern was seated to the side under explicit instruction not to escalate the matter beyond his convoy jurisdiction. The warden presented the halted shipment as proof of reckless alarmism, arguing that minor counting discrepancies occurred in any large-scale operation, and that publicly challenging inspection stamps invited distrust harmful to the war effort. Yet Lillian responded not with indignation, but with careful chronology, outlining the timeline of ledger alterations, serial number matches, and field shortage reports communicated by Halpern's convoy contacts, emphasizing that her actions aimed to prevent wounded soldiers from receiving incomplete kits, rather than to question patriotism itself. As murmurs moved through the room, several dock workers who had witnessed the open crates confirmed the visible shortages, complicating the narrative of hysteria. But the warden pressed further, suggesting that Lillian's earlier street punishment had not silenced her, and that continued agitation might warrant removal from warehouse duties pending investigation. In that moment, the hearing became less about gauze counts and more about authority versus accountability. And while Halpern remained composed, aware that overt intervention could be portrayed as outside coercion, the weight of the confrontation settled squarely on Lillian, who understood that defending the truth now required standing steady before neighbors who had once watched her scrub pavement in silence, transforming a supply audit into a test of whether a wartime town would confront uncomfortable facts or retreat behind slogans of morale. The hall filled beyond its usual capacity, not because the town enjoyed spectacle, but because uncertainty unsettled communities more deeply than open accusation, and as council members called the hearing to order, the civil defense warden reiterated his claim that shipment delays endangered soldiers abroad, while implying that internal dissent created vulnerabilities exploitable by enemies, framing Lillian's actions as emotional overreach, rather than procedural diligence. When invited to respond, she stepped forward with steady composure and requested that the intercepted crates be brought into the hall, a request granted reluctantly, yet impossible to refuse without appearing evasive. And as the lids were pried open before the assembled crowd, she invited council members to count the gauze bundles and morphine ampules themselves, aligning each physical shortfall against the printed manifest affixed to the crate, forcing the discrepancy into shared visibility rather than private dispute. Corporal Halpern then addressed the council with restrained authority, explaining that field medics in North Africa and the Pacific relied on exact kit allocations to stabilize wounded men within minutes of injury, and that even modest shortages compounded across multiple shipments could determine survival outcomes during mass casualty events, a statement that reframed the issue from warehouse technicality to battlefield consequence. He presented convoy correspondence referencing repeated shortfalls tied to the same serial designations processed through the Oregon facility, clarifying that the request for inspection had originated from documented field concerns rather than local rumor. And as he spoke, the hall's attention shifted from suspicion toward sobering realization that the matter at hand touched the lives of sons, brothers, and husbands serving overseas. When the warden attempted to argue that clerical adjustments could account for minor variances, Lillian calmly displayed copies of ledger pages bearing quantity reductions recorded after inspection stamps were applied, noting mismatched ink tones and timestamp inconsistencies that indicated post-approval alteration, evidence subtle yet methodical, and as council members compared the documentation against the open crates before them, the weight of pattern replaced the comfort of denial. By the hearing's close, a motion was introduced to initiate independent review of warehouse oversight and temporarily relieve supervisory authority pending investigation, a decision that did not celebrate Lillian, but acknowledged the legitimacy of her claims. And as townspeople filtered out into the cool coastal night, the street where she had once scrubbed in silence now carried murmured acknowledgement that vigilance at home might matter as much as valor abroad, marking a shift not merely in policy but in collective conscience. Within days of the town hall hearing, an independent review team from Regional Military Logistics arrived in Harborview, their presence quiet but unmistakable as they began cross-checking warehouse manifests against field hospital requisitions, and what they uncovered extended beyond minor clerical inconsistency, revealing a steady siphoning of morphine ampoules and sterile gauze, redirected through intermediary suppliers at inflated resale value, a black market diversion disguised as wartime redistribution under the cover of rapid production quotas. As the auditors presented their findings to the municipal council in a closed-door session, later summarized publicly, the pattern of altered timestamps and repeated serial code reductions aligned precisely with the discrepancies Lillian had documented, transforming her from accused agitator into primary whistleblower whose vigilance had halted a chain of shortages before further shipments left the coast. The civil defense warden who had framed her concerns as morale disruption was relieved of oversight authority pending investigation into procedural negligence, and while no grand apology was delivered from the podium, the tone of the town shifted perceptibly, because dock workers who once avoided meeting her gaze now nodded in acknowledgement, recognizing that the halted convoy had prevented incomplete kits from reaching field medics struggling to stabilize wounded servicemen. Halpern remained measured in public demeanor, careful not to appear triumphant, yet when he confirmed to Lillian that Convoy Command had ordered revised inspection protocols along the Pacific supply route, it became clear that her insistence on evidence over silence had rippled beyond Harborview streets into broader corrective action. One evening, as fishermen mended nets along the harbor and the sky softened into muted orange, a group of warehouse clerks approached Lillian to thank her quietly for challenging a system that had intimidated them into compliance, admitting that they too had noticed irregularities, but feared reprisal under accusations of defeatism. In that understated exchange, the meaning of the street humiliation reversed, because the pavement she had scrubbed under supervision no longer symbolized enforced silence, but the moment when scrutiny began. And while no parade marked the shift, the collective understanding that accountability strengthened, rather than weakened, wartime unity took root, proving that morale built on truth endured longer than morale enforced through intimidation. When the war ended and blackout regulations were lifted from Harborview's storefronts, the coastal town resumed a steadier rhythm, freight ships now carrying reconstruction supplies instead of emergency medical cargo. Yet the events of 1943 lingered quietly in the collective memory of those who had witnessed how easily fear of disloyalty could silence legitimate concern. Lillian Carter continued her work in logistics, but under revised inspection protocols that required dual verification and transparent record-keeping. Changes introduced after the investigation confirmed diversion of medical supplies through a small network of intermediaries whose contracts were quietly dissolved under federal review. And although her name did not appear in national headlines, Regional Command acknowledged that the halted shipment from Oregon had prevented repeated shortages from compounding across multiple field hospitals during a critical period of overseas operations. Corporal James Halpern returned to active medical duty overseas after his coastal assignment concluded, and correspondence between them continued through letters that spoke less of dramatic rescue and more of shared responsibility, reflecting a bond formed not from romance, but from mutual insistence that care for the wounded began long before a stretcher reached a battlefield. When he finally revisited Harborview after discharge, and he found that the same stretch of Main Street where Lillian once scrubbed a pavement under watchful eyes now held a modest plaque near the shipyard entrance honoring Homefront service and civilian vigilance, an inscription chosen deliberately to emphasize that safeguarding soldiers required integrity at every stage of supply. Years later, when Lillian passed that plaque on her way to work, she no longer remembered the sting of bristles against her palms, as sharply as the moment the brush was taken from her hand, because what endured was not humiliation, but the decision that followed it, the refusal to allow silence to mask risk. And in a town once quick to equate doubt with disloyalty, her story became quiet proof that questioning flawed systems could strengthen rather than weaken unity. The war had demanded sacrifice from many, that yet it had also demanded courage in unexpected forms. And in Harborview, the lesson remained clear long after the ship stopped carrying munitions. Patriotism built on truth was sturdier than patriotism enforced by fear. And sometimes the smallest act, pulling someone away from enforced silence, could alter the course of accountability for years to come.